Hi, Founder fans. Welcome to Founder of the Day, Week in Review, about 45 minutes late. For those of you tuning in live, thank you for coming. For those of you watching in the future, you don't realize that I am pretty late. Short story long, we had a little bit of a critter issue underneath our sink. We were not entirely sure what it was. I tried to get in there and chase it out, but couldn't find anything. It sounded... I heard purring, was under the impression it was a raccoon, and we had as someone come in. Hi, Robin, thank you for tuning in. Hi, Ashley, thank you so much for coming, despite how late it is. Turns out, whatever it was got out somehow, got through a little hole, so it definitely wasn't a raccoon like I thought it was. We were told it was probably a red squirrel. Thank you for your concern. Everyone is fine. This is the most disheveled I will be probably in any live video I ever do, because I was just got out of the shower, ready to do the video, and whammy, we hear a scratching. So, unfortunately, I don't have my images up here. I can probably do the internet scene and show you some pictures of the people, but let's get into it. Enough about me. One last thing. Tomorrow, I am going to be a guest on the Kentucky History Podcast. Thank you, Jameson, for inviting me. Tomorrow it will be live on Facebook Live. There'll be an interview, and then after that, I'm going to go actually on the podcast. So if you like Kentucky history in particular, we're going to be talking about the American Revolution as it involves Kentucky tomorrow at 9 Eastern, I believe is the exact time, on their Facebook Live page. So subscribe over there. Thank you for having me again. Kentucky History Podcast. So let's talk. I can't catch my breath right now. Okay. Let's talk about the American founding. Anyhoozle, we're going to start with James Sullivan. Now, I am going to pop this up, and this is how unprepared I am. I don't even have it up, do I? No sponsor on this webcam. Here, I am so sorry about this. We are going to click on James Sullivan. There he is, James Sullivan. Okay, great. Whammy. Pull him up real quick. Again, forgive me. Hopefully, if no one new is showing up right now, because I am usually a lot more ready to go live than I am right now. We're going to talk about James Sullivan. This is James Sullivan. He was a governor of Massachusetts. I will pull myself back up real quick. James Sullivan was, as a child, he develops epilepsy and has an injury to his leg also. So when the American Revolution begins, he is unable to actually fight in the war. But that's okay, because he studies law. He actually studies law under his brother, John Sullivan. And while James Sullivan becomes famous as a Massachusetts founder, his brother, John Sullivan, becomes famous as a New Hampshire founder, and arguably more famous for his role as a major general in the Continental Army, most notable for the Sullivan-Clinton campaign in upstate New York, waged against the Native Americans there, and the Battle of Rhode Island. James Sullivan, who we're speaking about right now, he ends up going into politics just as the Revolutionary War is breaking out, still a fairly young man. He ends up going to the Provincial Congress. While he's there, he helps write the first two Massachusetts constitutions. The first one, of course, I shouldn't say of course, the first one doesn't get passed. The one in 1780 actually does get passed. It's a little less democratic, and that's the one they accept. Right away, even before that's accepted, James Sullivan finds himself appointed to the Massachusetts Supreme Court. And he sits there for several years until the mid-1780s, when he realizes he's been losing a lot of money being a Supreme Court justice, and decides, hey, maybe I should actually be go back to private practice. And he does. And while he's there, Shays Rebellion happens, and James Sullivan actually defends some of the Shays rebels in the trials that ensue. After this, a few years later, in 1790, James Sullivan becomes the Attorney General of Massachusetts, and he holds this position for more than 15 years, which is interesting because this is the person who defended Shays rebels from the Attorney General, and now he would have been the one prosecuting them had it happened then. He's also at this point chosen by the federal government to go and help determine the boundary between the Maine and New Brunswick in Canada. And it's interesting because after the American Revolution was over, the Treaty of Paris seemed to define the borders, but then John Jay goes over and makes the Jay Treaty with Great Britain, and they try and redefine the borders. But then there's some confusion because Maine was so poorly documented that, I shouldn't say poorly documented, just had not been fully documented yet, or surveyed is the word I should be using. And when James Sullivan goes up there, there's confusion as to what rivers are actually called what names. And after several years, James Sullivan does help them determine that and help settle the border between Maine and Canada. Now, throughout this time, James Sullivan, he sides with the Democratic Republican Party, though it's a fairly heavy Federalist. Massachusetts. So he runs for governor on several occasions, loses many times, and then they stop running him for about a decade. Then they start again, and eventually they do run him, and he does. Finally, in 1807, James Sullivan wins the office of governor of Massachusetts, and he holds this position for 2 years. And there's a little bit of controversy, and I know we're talking about elections nowadays, which we don't talk about elections on this channel. We don't talk about modern politics on this channel, but there were some questions about his election, specifically about his opponent. They didn't accept certain misspellings of last names for the one candidate, but they did accept misspellings of last names for the other candidate. Although, to be fair, if I'm remembering correctly, the one name was Strong, and the other name, well, no, Sullivan isn't that hard to spell. It doesn't matter. But Sullivan's actually a fairly moderate candidate. It's one of the appealing things about him. And he gets very criticized because he helps, President Thomas Jefferson, who was president at the time of Sullivan's gubernatorial election. Sullivan helps. Jefferson passes the Embargo Act, and the Embargo Act is not very popular, especially in Federalist areas, and his helping with that doesn't help him win favors. But despite this, he is elected to a second term even afterwards, but he passes away during his second term after several years of declining health. James Sullivan, again, I wish I had more time to talk about him. We are going to try and get through him as quick as we can today because, well, we were under attack. Pull this back up. We're going to talk now about Brutus. As most of you know, every Friday I publish an article about Anti-Federalists. I've been going through the papers of Brutus this week, and last Friday I published on the fifth Brutus essay. Unfortunately, they don't have great names. It's just Brutus 1, Brutus 2, or Brutus I, Brutus II, Brutus V for 5. But I give them fun names. I call this one the abuse of necessary and proper. So essentially throughout this particular paper, published December 13th, 1787, Brutus is attacking the necessary and proper clause. I do see your question, Ashley. I will get to it. Brutus attacks the necessary and proper clause. It's the favorite thing for anti-federalists to go after, necessary and proper, because it's so open-ended, and that's their argument, that you can do whatever is necessary and proper to lay and collect taxes for the common defense and general welfare. And Brutus, as we will see over the next several papers, really attacks this in more or less saying, so you can lay and collect taxes for the general welfare on literally anything in any amount as long as it's deemed necessary and proper. Well, who gets to deem that it's necessary and proper? I will remind you that over the last few weeks, we have talked about how Brutus was saying that there would be so few representatives that they would become very distant from the people themselves and therefore form this elite, a bit of a class that would be very difficult for the people to, first of all, any of the people at large to infiltrate and become part of, but more to the point, to control. Now, he goes very deep into the idea of laying and collecting taxes. He also says that it's so, the limits of the federal government would defy any restrictions that were being laid on it. There are restrictions in the Constitution as to what can happen, but I have a quote here I'd like to read from Brutus, who said about these restrictions that, quote, "Some of them are improper, some unimportant, and others not easily understood." Meaning, they're garbage rules. They don't matter. They won't ever matter. They're so specific, but when you're laying necessary and proper taxes, and he points to Europe, for example, and says, look at how many thousands of laws there are. He's like, I can't even go through them in this one paper. There are just so many different layers of laws regarding taxation and what's necessary and what's proper that it can be used and abused at will if we accept it. Let's see. I'm going to read Ashley's question real quick. Was there a reason why Sullivan sent to work on the Canadian-Maine border dispute? Was there a particular reason he was chosen? I think that's your question you're asking. Timothy Pickering was the Secretary of State who asked him to do it. Again, Timothy Pickering was from Massachusetts. He was a Federalist, but better labeled a Hamiltonian, part of the Essex junto we were talking about recently of Massachusetts. That was the strongest wing of the Federalist Party that ran it, more or less. And therefore, he seems to, they seem to have been friendly, and he did, he would have chosen, again, Sullivan at that time was seen as a moderate in a fairly heavily Federalist state, but a Federalist state that kept electing Sam Adams in the 1790s as governor, who himself was a former anti-Federalist and more closely associated with the Democratic Republicans than the Federalists. I did leave out, too, about James Sullivan. He came up in an interview I did with Jane Hampton Cook over the summer. I should have put a link below. I don't have any links below to anything. I don't have a good thumbnail. I reuse an old thumbnail. Probably has the wrong date on it. I will change that. But I suggest you look it up. I wish I meant to include it down here. Again, I'm sorry. My family was under attack from a red squirrel, apparently, today. But I suggest you look that up, because she brings up that James Sullivan had a very interesting back and forth conversation with John Adams after Abigail Adams wrote the Remember the Ladies letter. James Sullivan was arguing, it's hard to say he was arguing for women's suffrage, but he was definitely arguing for more rights for women, definitely for black people. He was a very forward-thinking, open-minded person when it comes to civil liberties for everyone like that. He's a very interesting candidate. I breezed through him quicker than I wanted to, and I apologize. Speaking of breezing through, let's go to James Nicholson. James Nicholson was the senior captain of the Continental Army. And look at him. I don't think he has a cut there. I think that's just how it came out. Senior captain of the Continental Army. And again, on the weekends, I like to put up, do I ever do early colonial history? Hi, I'm Thomas Hardy. Thank you for coming. Again, I apologize. I'm a little unprepared today if you're new here. It's a little bit of a fiasco this afternoon. In my household. I don't usually do early colonial history. I'll put myself back up here to talk directly to you. Usually I focus on the American Revolution. Years are generally 1762 to 1826 about. More or less the end of the 7 Years' War, aka the French and Indian War, through the end of the James Monroe administration. That being said, I have covered a little bit earlier stuff. I do like to learn about it. Speaking of interviews, I interviewed Stephen Coates, who had written a book about the smallpox epidemic in Boston in 1722. And that's pretty much as early as I've gone. So sorry to disappoint you. I hope you'll enjoy the American Revolution. Feel free to like and subscribe. I assure you I'm usually more prepared than I am today. But either way, let's talk about James Nicholson. And this is extremely fun. If you like Alexander Hamilton, you're interested in the duel that he's more famous for. This is about a duel that didn't happen. So just to put some context, James Nicholson was, he was already an important Marylander when the American Revolution broke out. He was already the captain of several ships, and therefore he was named captain of the ship Virginia when the Continental Navy was originally formed. And he ends up as the first named. He is the senior captain of the Continental Navy. He's not the Commodore. The Commodore is the Commodore is Essex Hopkins from Rhode Island, brother of Stephen Hopkins, who we've discussed recently. But he was the senior captain, so we'll give him that. Either way, he gets out on the Virginia. He's out there. He runs into some British, and then his boat is kind of trapped, and it's getting fired on, and it gets captured. And as the boat is getting captured, Nicholson gets on a lifeboat and sails away. and lets his men get captured. Now, this didn't necessarily go swimmingly with everyone. He is not immediately given any problems, mostly because his men were captured and no one really knew what happened, so there was no one to tell on him. But word gets around eventually, and he ends up resigning his position before he can really get into too much trouble. That's not to stop him from helping the American Revolution. He becomes a federal commissioner of loans just after the revolution is ending. So the commissioner of loans essentially was a position where the Continental Congress had loans they were taking out. They had loans they were giving out. It was a banking position within the Continental Congress, essentially. Furthermore, he becomes a leading Democratic Republican as that starts, and he moves to New York City. So, he's a leading Democratic Republican living in New York City, where Alexander Hamilton is a leading Federalist. Now, while they're there, they come to a little bit of a head, and in July 1795, there is a heated argument between Nicholson and Hamilton, and Nicholson calls Hamilton a coward. Oof. Now, usually, a scoundrel is the harsh word you would call someone, or even a rascal. Not usually a coward, but he gets called a coward, and Hamilton is like, no, dude. As we know, not just Alexander Hamilton, but many founders were very secure in their honor, and if you get called something like a coward or a scoundrel or a rascal, well, then someone's got to go. And they challenged him to a duel. So Hamilton challenges Nicholson to a duel. Now, you probably haven't heard of this duel because they have their seconds, as we've learned what seconds are from the famous play Hamilton or from reading history books. I do want to point out who their seconds were. DeWitt Clinton, who was a future governor of New York, Henry Brockholst Livingston, who was a future Supreme Court Justice, Nicholas Fish, who is in that famous, and I've never actually written about, but I need to because he was very friendly with the Hamiltons, and Rufus King, a future lots of things. Original senator. I did a video on Rufus King recently. He's an amazingly important man. They all meet and they all try and figure out, okay, can we avoid this? Like, we don't want these two guys shooting each other. We care for these people. Let's see if we can do it. And unlike some of the other duels we've learned about, these seconds were successful. They actually figured out how to avoid a duel. All they had to do, James Nicholson had insulted Hamilton, and everyone agreed on that. And they basically just said, hey, Nicholson, we just need you to publicly apologize to Hamilton, and it'll be A-okay. And Nicholson agrees, and an apology is written and published. But you know who wrote the apology to Alexander Hamilton? Alexander Hamilton wrote his own apology on behalf of Nicholson because he wanted it to sound right. He wrote 3 drafts of an apology that someone else owed him, and Nicholson said, forget it, and just signed off on it. And that was that. Duel avoided. So that is the duel that didn't happen between Alexander Hamilton and James Nicholson. If you'll excuse me, I'm going to take a quick sip of my water. I roll up my sleeves. This might be the first video I've ever shot where I didn't roll up my sleeves beforehand. A few questions coming in. Misfit, giving me trouble. Ashley, clearly he never heard the saying, the captain goes down with the ship. Yeah, clearly he did hear that saying. It didn't give a hoot. Not cool. I'm going to pull this up. We're going to move on to the next person. Roger Enos, another founder many of you may never have heard of. This is his face. A nice looking guy. And there is a bug in here because, of course, it's that kind of day. Roger Enos bails on the trip to Quebec. So Roger Enos was a lieutenant colonel in the Connecticut militia and he led his men to Lexington and Concord. He was a Minuteman. He went there. He stayed there. Battle of Bunker Hill happened. He fights in Battle of Bunker Hill. He's a patriot. In the summer of 1775, he's patrolling outside Boston during the siege of Boston. Then he is given a special assignment. He is told to join Benedict Arnold on the expedition to Quebec. Now, need to do a side note here. I know the name Benedict Arnold rings a lot of bells, and we don't necessarily like it. I need to remind you, Benedict Arnold in the first half of the Revolutionary War was an American hero. If he had never been a traitor, he would to this day be one of the most admired Americans to ever live. Now, the reasons for this are upcoming, but they start with his trip through the Maine wilderness. You see, over in Albany, General Philip Schuyler, who wouldn't actually take the trip because he suffered from gout, but because of ill health, he had the Northern Army of the Continental Army, and he went up and sent up Richard Montgomery to Quebec. And Montgomery led men. They captured Montreal, they captured a bunch of Canada, and went up to Quebec, where they were going to meet up with Benedict Arnold outside of the fort at Quebec. Now, what Arnold wanted to do was travel through the woods of Maine. As we said before, Maine wasn't really well plotted out at this point, and in fact, they had extra trouble because they bought a map that was wrong. It is questionable whether or not the person who sold them the map knew it was wrong. Don't want to get into that right now, but Roger Enos was one of 3 men with Christopher Green and Daniel Morgan, who were to lead their companies with Benedict Arnold to Quebec to join the fight. Seems easy enough, except as I said, Maine was a wilderness, and they got some wrong maps, and everything was whoopsie-daisy, because they go up there, and there is a lot of trouble. They have no food to eat. It is the middle of winter in Maine. Hey, John Adams, thanks for coming. They get up there. There is a ton of problems, and they even have to eat Henry Dearborn's dogs. So it's not a great scene. Now, Roger Enos has these men under his command, and there is a debate. Do we continue, or do we turn around and go home? And Roger Enos actually decides, I'm going to take my men home. Green and Morgan stick with Arnold and finish the trip. As for that, they eventually make it to Quebec. They meet right outside the city. They decide to enter. They run in. As I said, Richard Montgomery was in the lead with Benedict Arnold right behind him. They open the doors. Richard Montgomery gets shot in the head, and immediately Benedict Arnold gets shot in the leg, and he gets dragged from the scene. And then because of that, they end up retreating just from Canada entirely. Arnold would, of course, forget about his wounds and start the First Navy on the waters of Lake Champlain, and then, years go by, and he's the hero of Saratoga, and, as I said, was an American hero for a little bit there, till he made some poor decisions. As for Roger Enos, he turns around for his men and brings them back home. Now, people begin to ridicule him as a traitor. And how could you bail? Because word gets around that the rest of the men made it and fought in the war. How could you, leave? Now, Roger Enos actually receives a court-martial to determine if he has done anything wrong. And he is actually cleared of wrongdoing because, again, he had a legitimate concern that his men would starve to death. And it was better to bring them back to the siege of Boston than to let them die. They were eating dogs. It was not good. It was and in the middle of winter, there was no other food to find. It's a miracle that Arnold and the rest of the men made it. And because of this, Enos was cleared of any wrongdoing. However, the court of public opinion had already made up their mind that Enos was a traitor. And therefore, Enos, he leaves the army, but he decides to relocate to Vermont. And while he's in Vermont, he makes a new home there. Because, again, he can't live in Connecticut anymore. But he gets a lot of respect in Vermont and eventually becomes a major general in the Vermont militia. Although this is after the war ends, of course. He spends the rest of his life there and becomes important enough that he's buried in the Allen family cemetery, where, more famously, Ethan Allen and his brother Ira Allen are both buried. So he ends up becoming a founder of Vermont. But he also, had that little whoopsie-daisy in there. All right. So that is the second of the 2 articles from the weekend, which are old ones that I republish. I only write 5 a week, as most of you know, I'm sure. Let's see. And while I'm doing this and bringing this up, if you guys want to hit like while you're here, that would be very much appreciated. Thank you so much. I'm going to pull this back up. We're going to talk about George Thatcher. George Thatcher is a guy I wrote about this week for the first time. Pull me back up. Excuse me. He was the longest serving inaugural congressman. So I do want to do a side note. Again, didn't put a link and didn't do anything today. But George Thatcher, we started just this week, and now my cat's coming in just to make some noise first. George Thatcher was the reading of the week. We started doing readings of the week this week. I had a book club for a little bit. Unfortunately, it's hard for people to read whole books nowadays. I understand that. So what we've done is I'm starting to do a reading of the week. I put out every Monday. Go to the website, find George Thatcher, read that there. My point is, I would also tell you to go join the Discord channel, but there's no link for that. Hit me up personally. I do have some things down below for social media and my email. Either way, when the Revolutionary War breaks out, George Thatcher is a student at Harvard. While he's there, like most people at Harvard, he decides to finish his studies and graduates in 1776, just as the Declaration of Independence is being signed. He does try to serve briefly on a privateer ship, thinking I'll help my country and make a little bit of money, but it turns out he is not very good at being a seafarer, and that does not last long. So what he does is actually, he follows what many other lawyers or future lawyers did at the time. He becomes a school teacher, and while he's a school teacher, he clerks and learns law under another professional lawyer. And this is, and I cannot say this name, Sherajashub Bourne. I'll pull it up for you because it's a great name. Hopefully you can see this right here. It's a little small. Sherajashub Bourne. And as a side note, I have written about Sherajashub Bourne. As a side note, he was once being sued, and his lawyer was John Adams, who was serving for Sherajashub Bourne as his lawyer on a hiatus from the Continental Congress, and he was actually working for Bourne when he found out he had been chosen to go to France. And Sherajashub Bourne was the last person that John Adams ever actually defended in court. So anyway, as for George Thatcher, he does get his law degree. He ends up moving to Maine, and he becomes a leader in Maine. And he starts publishing under pseudonyms. There's several of them. One of them is a Reasonable Christian, under which name he argues against state religions, which were common at the time. Even after the Constitution was written banning a federal church and state, there were several states that still had state churches that your taxes went to as tithes. After this, he writes under a more famous name called Scribble Scrabble. And while Thatcher... Cat... Come on. So while Thatcher's writing under Scribble Scrabble, he ends up getting... Dude, pardon me, guys. As if things couldn't get crazier today. My cat wants out for the first time ever. Any hoozle. George Thatcher writes under the name Scribble Scrabble. And while he's writing under this name, he publishes about extra-legal meetings. So he's in Maine, which at the time was technically Massachusetts. At exactly this time, the Shays Rebellion is starting. And the Shays Rebels at first have meetings, essentially like the committees of correspondence meetings before the American Revolution. Maine, on the other hand, was having meetings about, hey, should we be a state? Now, both these sets of meetings had different goals in mind. One was to stop the taxes in Western Massachusetts. One was to make Maine a state. But they were both extra legal. And the ones over here in Western Massachusetts were, got violent and got violently repressed. The one in Maine they were just going to petition for statehood. Now, this is in the mid-1780s. It would be another 30 plus years before Maine would become a state. But Scribble Scrabble writes about that people should have the opportunity to have these meetings and have these discussions. It should not be illegal. Because of this, first of all, the Shays Rebels and the people who side with Shays Rebels kind of look at him as one of their champions. But the elites in Boston, who didn't like Shays Rebels, still thought of him as a moderate, because he was just trying to get Maine statehood, and he was trying to go by the good ways to do it. And because of this, since he was seen as a moderate, well, since they needed someone to go to the Continental Congress anyway, he became a compromise candidate, and Thatcher was chosen as a delegate to the Continental Congress. He had never, in his life up to this point, held any political office. He was just some Maine lawyer who wrote under a pseudonym, and people found out who he was, and they said, okay, yes, send him. I will remind you that at the time, in the mid-1780s, right about the time they're about to start writing the Constitution, the Continental Congress wasn't really something people saw as a good office that they wanted. You didn't get a lot of power in your state, and you didn't have any power over there. In fact, even though Thatcher was one of the most frequent attendees at the Continental Congress, then meeting in New York City, there were still complaints, especially notably from Nathan Dane, I read, who was complaining he's not there. Either way, excuse me, he does this, and whatever. It's not important. No one seems to care. But then the United States Constitution is ratified, and people are calling for, you need to elect representatives. And George Thatcher, well, he's doing a pretty good job in the Continental Congress, and he didn't seem to mind traveling all the way to New York City. So he got elected to the Continental Congress. He got elected to the House of Representatives, and he was an inaugural member of the United States House of Representatives. And he stayed there for 12 years until 1801. And when he left in 1801, he was the only original member of the U.S. House of Representatives still there. And for a while, he was the longest serving member. Nowadays, we don't talk about American politics on this channel, or modern politics on this channel, but nowadays people there are a lot longer than 12 years. And at that point, it was a long time. What's interesting is when he returned home to retire, he was then chosen to sit on the Massachusetts Supreme Court. And he would spend 25 years, a quarter of a century, on the highest judicial body in the state of Massachusetts. And he lived there long enough, actually, to see Maine become a state. And when that was happening, he actually technically moved to Massachusetts proper so he could continue for about 4 more years as a justice on the Supreme Court before retiring, going back to Maine, where he lived the rest of his life. I do see a bunch of things coming. I think you guys are hanging out a little bit over here. I don't know if there's any questions. Any reason why Scribble Scrabble? I don't know. It is a good pseudonym, Ashley. I agree with you. I was unable to see that. Like I said, there is a reading of the week. It's on... I posted it on the Discord channel under reading of the week. So check it out there. It's a little bit long, but it's not a full book. Although it is... I did realize after I posted part of a full book. But that book is mostly his correspondence. Very interesting. Actually, there's a good amount on there, too, about his correspondence with his wife. So if you're interested in learning about what it was like to be an elite woman in Maine, give it a read. Any other questions? Won't burn me in a skillet? No, I didn't. Excuse me, please. I'm sorry. Let's continue here with our next founder. And you guys better hit like while you're here. I really appreciate it. It's the best thing in the whole wide world you can do. We're going to go over here to just a building because John McKinley does not have, and I actually spelled it wrong here. There's no E up here. Whoopsie daisy. I will have to fix that. John McKinley, when he got kidnapped. So John McKinley was slow to the rebel cause. He was a he born in Ireland, moved to Maryland. Let's say Delaware because that's actually where he's from. Moved to Delaware as a young man, early 20s, 21, 22, around there. He quickly earns the respect of his community as a physician. He's practicing medicine, and by 1757, he's actually chosen as sheriff of his county while living in Wilmington. And he's sheriff for like 15 years. And during this time, he's sheriff for 3 or 4 years. And during this time, he's also elected Chief Burgess of Wilmington. And that's a fancy way to say mayor. He was mayor of Wilmington for on and off for about 15 years, leading up to the American Revolution. During this time, he also alternates, spending a good portion of it on the Colonial Assembly. And leading up to the Revolutionary War, he's on the Colonial Assembly. He is very slow to support independence. Wilmington, and Delaware in particular, was heavily loyalist. So to be moderate was in a fashion extreme. In fact, Delaware is famous for Caesar Rodney's ride because one of the two delegates left was not in favor of independence at the time. So independence is had, however, and the Colonial Assembly, now the Provincial Assembly, chooses McKinley, who was, again, seen as a moderate, to be president. Now, technically we would call this governor now, But at the time, the way their first constitution was hastily put together, he wasn't really governor of Delaware. He was more of president of the provincial assembly overseeing the revolution. Now, this is not to say he did not throw himself into the cause, because as soon as independence is declared, he does side with the Patriots, and again, he becomes technically first governor after independence. Now, he spends most of this time overseeing the war and making sure things went well. It doesn't go very well, because September of 1777, there's the Battle of Brandywine, and although it's not in Delaware, General Howe, leading the British, sends a section of troops over to Wilmington to take it over. The goal is to use Wilmington as mostly as a hospital, but also as a storage point for supplies and any ships that have to come in. It had a good port for that. Now, McKinley is aware that this might happen, but he is so dedicated to the cause, as he writes in a letter to, I think he wrote it to Henry Lawrence. Don't quote me on that. I forget exactly who the letter was to I read, but he does explain himself, saying that he thought it was more important to stay in the city and continue overseeing operations of the state militia than to run and hide like other people would do, like Thomas Jefferson is usually accused of doing down in Virginia. That being said, McKinley's not 100% aware that soldiers are on their way to Wilmington, and he is actually asleep in his bed when the British arrive and kick in his door and kidnap him, for lack of a better term, and he's held hostage for a while. He's actually brought on a prison ship, although it doesn't seem to be one of the everyone's going to die here prison ships like most of them. It seems like he was kind of held on a regular British ship. But he is a very important person, and that's why he's kept around and not put on the crappy ships. And he's held for almost an entire year, until finally he's exchanged for William Franklin. William Franklin, I'll remind you, is the son of Benjamin Franklin, who was royal governor of New Jersey when the Revolution broke out and sided with the Loyalists because he was, a royal governor, and that's a pretty good gig. And also, William Franklin was the father of William Temple Franklin, who was Ben Franklin's grandson and would serve as secretary to the delegation that signed the Treaty of Paris to end the Revolution. So William Franklin's father and son were both hardy patriots. William not so much, and he was exchanged for John McKinley, who after this, he does end up running for governor later, but doesn't win, and basically just retires to his medical practice. But he invests a lot in early childhood education in the state, particularly, I think it was called the Norwalk School. I can't remember exactly the name of the school. Or Norwich, might be the Norwich Academy. Okay, that is our friend John McKinley. Anyway, we're going to go to our last person here. I'm going to take a sip of water while I bring him up. Thank you for hitting like and subscribing despite my unpreparedness. I assure you, anyone new here, I am usually much better prepared. And we're talking about Randolph Jefferson, TJ's little bro. No image known, so we're going to use this image. You have to stare at this, or, put it outside while you're doing dishes. Listen. Anyway, Randolph Jefferson is the younger brother of Thomas Jefferson. He was actually a twin. He had a sister. The name escapes me. I'm not sure which sister was the twin. I apologize off the top of my head. Again, a little frazzled today. Randolph was 12 years younger than Thomas Jefferson and just 2 years old when his father dies. Now, he's actually raised by a gentleman named John Harvey, who takes over all of the Jefferson children, because when Peter Jefferson dies, even Thomas Jefferson is still only 12 years old. So they are under the care of John Harvey, who was Jefferson's best friend's father, until Thomas Jefferson comes of age, at which point it's about the same time that John Harvey dies, and Thomas Jefferson actually takes over Randolph Jefferson's care. And he sees to it that he gets a great education. He goes to William and Mary, just like Thomas Jefferson does, learns to play violin, just like his older brother. There were pretty big differences in character between the two. Thomas Jefferson is known to be studious, and they're both fun, but Thomas Jefferson is a deep thinker who spends lavishly and goes deeply into debt throughout his life and actually dies in debt, despite his vast holdings. and therefore Thomas Jefferson's will is not very valuable. Randolph Jefferson, on the other hand, he's not such a deep thinker. He's actually known. I read an interesting quote that from a slave at Monticello who said later, years later, reflected back on Randolph Jefferson. Randolph liked to go out among the slaves and fiddle and dance the night away, which is interesting. For those of you who don't know, a fiddle and a violin are the same thing. A violin is when you play it properly, and a fiddle is when you rock out. This is the best way I can explain it. Anyway, so he was a lot of fun. That's not necessarily to say that he was a pro freedom or anything like that. In fact, Randolph Jefferson would inherit. The name of the property is eluding me. Stromwell, not Shadwell. He grew up at Shadwell. Actually, Randolph Jefferson was living at Shadwell, which was after Thomas Jefferson moved out and had his own property. His mother was living with him at Shadwell, and when it burned down, famously burned down, lost a lot of important papers. Snowden, like Edward Snowden. That's why it kept reminding me of Edward Snowden. The name of the property that Randolph Jefferson inherited was called Snowden. And he comes of age in 1776. So just as Thomas Jefferson is writing the Declaration of Independence, he no longer has to take care of his little brother. He is now a full-grown man at 21 or so, and he ends up, he does fight in the war. He joins the Virginia Light Dragoons and fights in the militia. He doesn't seem to fight a whole lot, but he does participate in when they're passing his property, he offers his property to the Continental Army on several occasions for a variety of things. Now, what's really interesting about Randolph Jefferson is his will. So come with me here. First, in 1781, just as the Revolution's ending, he marries his cousin, Anna Jefferson Lewis, who I guess would go by Anna Jefferson Lewis Jefferson at that point. No, probably she would have gone by Anna Lewis Jefferson. Either way, not uncommon to marry cousins at that point. They have 6 children before she passes away in the late 1790s. And after that, Randolph Jefferson marries a woman named Michie Barlow Pryor. Now, Michie Barlow Pryor at this point was much younger. He was at this point in his mid to late 50s, and she was in her early 20s. She might not have even been 21. As you can imagine, his sons, who were her age, didn't love this. And in fact, she seems to be a little bit of a sneaky snake. And we know this because Randolph Jefferson dies in 1815. Now, his brother Thomas has already been president at this point for several years. But Thomas Jefferson had always been his lawyer. And all legal things, he'd always gone to his older brother Thomas to talk and get things done. So in 1808, he went to Thomas and they wrote out a will for Randolph that he signed, and everything was fine, and gave most of the property to his sons. Then Randolph marries Michie. And there is when he dies, all of a sudden this other will shows up that was signed, and Thomas Jefferson is called forward to give a disposition as his literal lifetime legal advisor. Like Jefferson was a lawyer by the time Thomas was a lawyer by the time Randolph is like 12. So like literally his entire life, he's been his lawyer, and suddenly this other will shows up. So Jefferson's called in on the request of Randolph's sons. Thomas comes in to give this disposition, and in it he says, he's always come to me. He's always been of sound mind and body, but he was very good at he had a lot of empathy for people. So if people were like, "Please help me," according to Thomas, Randolph would always say yes, because he wanted people to be happy. That was just in his nature. It seems, according to Thomas Jefferson's disposition, that Randolph Jefferson, his wife, was going into town and spending a lot of his money. Again, Thomas Jefferson ends up going deeply into debt. Randolph Jefferson didn't. In fact, the point of the whole problem with his will is when he died, his estate was very valuable. He lived fairly frugally for a wealthy man who, owned a plantation and did have many slaves, at least 20 at one point. But I guess it got to the point where Mitchie, his wife, was going into town and just spending lavishly, and Randolph was nervous about this. So Randolph actually came up with a special insignia that he would put on his letters when he bought things from town, because Mitchie was even faking his signature. And it got to the point where Mitchie learned how to also fake that insignia. And it was about this time that the new will was signed. And the impression that the Randolph's sons were given is that this was done under duress. And again, Thomas Jefferson doesn't indicate that Randolph was necessarily like losing his mind or anything like that. He just was empathetic to his spouse who wanted him to sign this, and he was like, okay, fine, whatever you want. And his sons were not happy about this. They'd only been married a few years when he passed away, actually, in his late 50s, to an unknown illness. And what's interesting is it ends up that the property ends up being sold off and divided amongst everyone, although it is noted that the slaves did go to his wife and child, because apparently Mitchie was pregnant when Randolph died. Now, that child is named John, and Mitchie and John end up moving to Tennessee, where they spend the rest of their life. So that is the Randolph Jefferson estate controversy. If you are interested in the Jefferson family, you probably enjoyed that. And that is the last founder of the week. Again, guys, I'm real sorry about everything being delayed. It's a very strange night. This is the worst video I've done in quite some time, which I'm actually happy about because I've been working very hard at making these better for you. Again, I am going to be a guest on the Facebook Live for the Kentucky History Podcast tomorrow. We're going to talk about some Kentucky founders. So if you're interested in that, please check it out. Definitely follow them on Facebook. Actually, yeah, it's some story. You know, the Revolution is just full of fun stories. I mean, like the James Nicholson one with Hamilton and that other duel that didn't happen. James Sullivan, I just did not get nearly into depth as I wanted to tonight. We're only at 50 minutes. I mean, I guess I did pretty much the whole... I guess it is pretty much as long as it usually is. But yeah, so thank you guys so much. I will be back with another one tomorrow. Thanks, TJ. I'm glad you're here. At least I'm sure it helped you going a little bit later for you. You guys on the West Coast. So yeah, that's about it. I am going to call it because again, my mind still isn't really here. Thank you all for your support. And I think everyone here has been here, but if you're new here, definitely hit subscribe for videos all sorts of days of the week. And with that, I can't even remember what the sign off is. Plainfield? No, round bottom. Okay.